We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. And today what we're going to do is the second in my series called Prophetic Voices. I did one, a year ago or so? I meant to do more, but I find there's a great value in just listening to people, not interrupting them in their mind, but trying to understand what people who have interesting, trustworthy thoughts. What is an interesting, trustworthy thought? Well, for one thing, if someone I trust recommends someone to me, then that's a good recommendation, and I can trust that. Secondly, if I've spent enough time with someone, that's a good way to trust them as well, because then you should always be able to say who you appreciate, who you followed, and what your disagreements are with them. Because if you simply say, I just love everything that this person has said, you probably don't really understand something. Or if you simply say, I understand everything, you probably don't. So we're going to listen to different people talking about different things. Architecture shows up, design, but also the meaning of these things. We're not just talking about these things like they're cool or something. But what is the meaning of a structure? How can a structure be said to be living versus one that's said to be dead? The same with art. What happens when art just becomes philosophy or ideas versus what art should be, which is somehow related to beauty? We'll be listening to different people. Hans Rookmaaker is back, and it's a bit from a lecture of his called The Post-Christian World that he gave in 1976. Also, we have Nick Cave talking after the first death of his son. He had two sons die, and he wrestles with God, the meaning of suffering. And also he talks about a little bit about cancel culture, which he says is really a misnomer. We listened to Tom Wolfe from the 1970s talking with William F. Buckley about his then controversial book, The Painted Word, in which he basically said, and I think very truthfully, especially the more time I spent in New York in the art world, the more I said, oh no, Tom Wolfe's got it, and they don't really like him at all, because what he's doing is saying it's moved from being painting to simply being what he calls the painted word. It's just ideas now. Godfrey Reggio, who directed the Koyaanisqatsi or the Qatsi trilogy of different collage images, but part of his influence was Jacques Ellul, and he talks a bit about the fact that we now are we conduct all of our experience, for the most part, within technology, and that's not good news. Paul Virilio, who I'm going to play something here where he's talking in French, and then a translator will come on and interpret what he's saying. It'll require a little patience from you, but I think you've got it. And he's talking about the problems of optics. At one point in one of his books, unfortunately that's back in my library in Alaska, he says every new optical device that we invent for seeing is one more way in which we can no longer see. Something to think about. But he talks about similar ideas here. Roger Scruton is here to talk about the meaning of art. Lord Kenneth Clark, from his Civilization series, gives his final summation from that series, which I thought was important. Marshall McLuhan from Canada in the 70s, late 70s, talking about essentially how our media isolates us and creates more violence. And I think this is important for us today. Christopher Alexander is relatively new to me. Job told me about him. He is an architect, but he's an architect with very interesting ideas that kind of go against the current architectural orthodoxy, which always includes the phrase, form follows function. And for him, the form has to be alive, and so much architecture today is dead. And the question is why? And finally, we end with Cormac McCarthy in a recent interview, which I think he gave because he has a couple new books coming out, both together. And in this, he talks about, it has this kind of slow Texas sort of reflections. Texans are, real Texans are quite laconic. And he talks about philosophy and the importance of thinking, but also there's a mysterious aspect to it. So these are the kinds of people we're going to listen to. Oh, also Jane Jacobs, who wrote a book about the New Dark Age. But here she talks about the problems of urban planning and how essentially our architecture and our plans essentially maroon us within. There's a lot of discussion here about the nature of art and the fact that technology has come and disrupted our relationship to the world. So, get ready for that. And while you're getting ready, think about this. Do you like these videos? Do you want to help support the channel? Well, you can. You can like. Sometimes we just say these things, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification. You hear these people say this all the time. But it really does matter. And especially, I have the feeling I'm on the wrong track for getting a lot of subscribers, or even the kind that a lot of people get, just because my content is so strange. It doesn't, whatever the algorithms are doing, they look at my content and go like, we don't understand, and they move on. Occasionally, something will pick up a little steam. But anyway, think about sharing it. And if you haven't supported the channel, there is a link below that will tell you what to do. So shall we go?
What I've been saying is, and what I'm going to re-say this morning, that if we really want to understand where we are today, and I began with that the first day that I began to talk, then we must understand that we live in a world which is bound, which is influenced so much, which is brainwashed by a kind of new approach to reality. Formerly, people thought in the line of ontology. Then, with the 18th century, there's a change, and we go into epistemology. Epistemology being the first. Of course, if you really have a close look at Kant, you will understand that he says that epistemology is first, but of course there is a kind of bit of ontology before you even go to epistemology, because you cannot have an epistemology unless you have an ontology. But it is something that is a new understanding of the world and a new understanding of man. It's autonomous man in an autonomous world. And science becomes the real new revelation, a man-made revelation to man. And men are very much in awe for what science brings us. Very interesting is the difference in the approach before and after the change. When Leeuwenhoek, he was a Dutchman, a very important scientist in the 17th century Amsterdam, and he was a very special man in making microscopes, and he was the first man ever to look through a microscope to a drop of water. And it's very interesting to read what he says. He says, if you look through that microscope and you see that drop of water, then I always thought that God created the world, but now I know that he created two worlds. And he begins to talk about it like this. It's creation, and he's just full of amazement. After the break, we just find new little things. Van den Berg, in his book, which you find in the bibliography, by the way, I don't know where the bibliography is gone to. There must be a pile still. Somebody asked me for it. If you know, please get some copies here back again. But Van den Berg, in his books, tried to make this clear with this. He says the old encyclopedia usually was arranged in a systematic way. It began with God, and then with the world, and so on. And it was just trying to understand the world. And if you look in that encyclopedia under the heading, The Devil's Plant, then you will find a description that this plant is a very powerful plant. Its saps are used for some medicine, and it has curious leaves, and the leaves have holes in it. And the holes are said to be the result of and then comes the story about the man, and the devil was trying to pursue him, but he was able to flee from the devil, but the devil was shooting some darts, and the darts hit this plant, and so there came holes in the leaves, and so you have the holes in the leaves because of that. That's why it's called the devil's plant. If you read in the new encyclopedia, which is arranged in a totally irrational, crazy way, that means by alphabet, that means completely without any system, because we have no system anymore, there is no one grasp on reality, then you look at that same plant, then you will find behind it a kind of Latin name, which makes it totally abstract, and then it goes on to tell you where it is, and what it means, and how it's built, and it will tell you probably that there are some kind of chemicals in it that you can use for medicine. But it's a completely different approach to the same plant. And I love that way that Van den Berg describes it. He says the old plant told you lies about the true plant. The new encyclopedia gives you true facts about the false plant or the no plant. It is gone. It has become completely abstract. We have lost our things. Formerly people stood in awe when there's a certain beetle that cuts the tree, that cuts the leaves in such a way that they can fold up for their little eggs to be laid in, and so on. And everybody would stand in awe. Look, God's creation, fantastic, how he can do this. Nowadays we say, oh, that's very easy. He just uses this mathematical formula and then it folds up nicely. You see, and we have lost all the awe, and all the mystery is gone. And this is a change. And I made a little scheme. I've done that many, many years. And maybe I have it again. The scheme is like this, that the old system is this. You have a triune God who created the world, the universe, and in the universe you have angels and devils, and man and animals and plants and things, and norms and laws. Just because of that, you can talk about good and evil. In this world, you can even talk about witches. In 1660, around that time, a book was produced in England that said, it's very easy to prove that God exists. Look around you, witches exist. And he just begins, he says, no, this is right, this is a fact. There are witches, and therefore he builds up this whole world scheme, and he says that's how it is. It's a little bit simplistic maybe, but it's true to a certain extent. Now what has happened in the 18th century is that people said, of course that's a simplification, it is a whole trend beginning with the Renaissance and so on, but it's in the 18th century with Locke and so on, up till Kant, that people said, well, we put God out of the door. It's too difficult, as soon as God is in the picture we get strife. We begin to fight. You have gone through so many religious wars. And let's get God out of the door and let decide things as human beings among human beings. But people very optimistically thought that nothing would change. But I think that's the sheer optimism. Of course, if I say God doesn't exist, even really meaning that sentence, nothing happens. I don't turn orange or green, or the ceiling doesn't fall down. So people say you can't say it. But they're just short-sighted, because something does happen. And what happens, of course, if you put God out of the picture, angels and devils go. And nobody weeps. But what's more important is that norms go. Where are the norms coming from? You see, originally people said, how do you know? Don't kill your neighbor? Well, God said so. But now, how can we do it? And you know all the story of Hobbes, who invented the little myth, and he said in the beginning of history, people found out that it's very difficult if people steal or kill. And so he made the social contract. And it is a man-made system to make society go. So you have the social contract. It's Hobbes. You all know him. And of course it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau who talked about these things about a century later. And that's the beginning of the Enlightenment, when these things began to be on reality. Now, if norms go, then you cannot talk about good and evil anymore. And of course it took time before these things were realized. But nowadays we see that around us. And again, nobody wept. But you begin to weep again, you begin to understand that man is gone.
And I was going to ask you to read the first three propositions of the Tractatus. You can probably do that from memory, but it's someone whom I know matters a great deal to you, and I sort of feel as if it would be worth.
He's interesting. Mm-hmm. He's just the thing that makes. The reason why everybody loves Wittgenstein is not because of his theories of languages, because they don't know what the hell he's talking about. Right. They love him because he lived the life of a philosopher. He inherited a huge amount of money in his mid-20s, and he gave it all away. Yeah. And people understand that. Said, yeah, he really is a philosopher. Yeah. Why did he give it away? Because he didn't think philosophers should be rich. No other reason. Right. But people understand that. Yeah. The world's all that is the case, totality of facts, not of things. I'm a big fan of his, but I don't agree with everything.
No, I know.
Determined by the facts, and by there being all the facts, totality of facts determines what is the case. And also whatever, okay, that's okay. The facts in logical space are the world. It's a way of putting it, and there's nothing that wrong with it, but I mean, it's, he said one time, he said, this thing's composed of these little paragraphs. Yeah. He said that each one of those paragraphs was a summary of a book he would never write. Is that true? No. Right. But it's interesting.
It's interesting. But I'm just wondering about that. The reason I'm curious about that is the style. I mean, we look at, the completely distinct style of the Tractatus and the Investigations. Yeah. Do you think part of the allure of Wittgenstein is as a stylist, the way he writes?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, it's very compact. Yeah. Like, as you say, even if every proposition and sub-proposition and sub-sub-proposition isn't a book, it's incredibly rich. Yeah. Right? And I'm just wondering, how much... Were you first drawn to Wittgenstein? What drew you first? Was it the history of, the whole Bloomsbury group and his relationship to Russell? The fact that, as you point out, he's a real philosopher. He lives by his principles. Yeah. Was a stylist. I mean, what's the...
I don't know, both. I mean, it's just... He's an attractive man. I mean...
That should be in there, man. That's part of the...
Like Joyce one time, after he'd had one of his eye operations, he was dictating Finnegan's Wake, to a friend in a semi-darkened room, and a friend of his knocked on the door, and he said, "Come in." Came in, they talked about other things, and the guy left, and Joe said, "Where?" It was Frank Budgeon, he was dictating. He said, "Where were you?" He said, "The last thing you said was come in." He said, "Oh, that was when Walter knocked on the door." He said, "No, leave it." Yeah. So somewhere it's in there.
Yeah, somewhere it's in, exactly.
Yeah. But no, he has a stylist, and
Yeah.
he's just in there. Plus, there's, if you compare him to Heidegger, for instance, I've read a bit of Heidegger. Nowhere in there is there anything about the moral life or whether that means anything. Or it didn't mean anything to him. He didn't consider it to be worth his attention. Whereas Wittgenstein thought of nothing else.
Yeah.
Everything that he thought about had to do with whether it was right or wrong. Yeah. And he worried about it constantly. And people write about him and say he was this difficult.
But this is
difficult.
But that's an interesting observation, right? Because again, that's part of your interest. I mean, this incredibly rigorous analytical style, dealing with very logical problems, but ultimately for Wittgenstein, an ethical concern.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very and not typical. I mean, ethicists don't write like that.
That's right.
Right, and I think, Spinoza, but that conjunction of maybe it's the right way to do it. Maybe to your earlier language unconscious point.
Well, the thing. I mean, the reason I say Wittgenstein and Heidegger is because they're generally conceived to be the two foremost philosophers of the 20th century. Yeah. And yet they're so very different. Yeah. And particularly now that Heidegger's journals have been published, you say, no, he really was a Nazi. Yeah, he was. It's not just Yeah. And he did horrible stuff. Yeah. And I guess ultimately you have to ask yourself the question that if philosophy is not concerned with how you should live, what in the hell is it concerned with? Yeah.
Do you think that's true broadly, living a mental life? Do you think it's true for science? Do you think it should have an impact?
Well, I don't know. It's like, we've talked about mine's foggy. I don't know that, but what's Grothendieck? Yeah, Grothendieck somewhere says, and I've read a lot of his stuff, he says, he talks about the morality of mathematics. Yeah. And you say, well, that's just kind of goofy. Well, it would be kind of goofy, except that he said it, and he's one of the great mathematicians. Yeah. So you have to pay attention. I mean, he doesn't say dumb things.
Then it turns out, first of all, that there is quite striking agreement. It's not 100%, but very strong. A strong agreement as one gets in a lot of scientific experiments of other kinds. And that the really strange part is that the things which are then measured by experiments of that sort are not, you see, it's sort of, all of these different experiments have to do with something like that. Do you feel more whole? Do you feel more alive in the presence of this thing? Do you feel that this one is more a picture of your own true self than this thing? Whatever. Always looking at two entities of some kind and comparing them as to which one has more life. It appears to be a rank bit of subjectivity. In other words, it sounds like, well, okay, fine. I mean, maybe this is a truth about human beings in the sense about our cognition or about our perception or about our feelings, but that's not necessarily the same as saying living structure as such is a real thing that resides in those objects. But anyway, to cut a long story short, it turns out that these kind of measurements do correlate with real structural features in the thing and with the presence of life in the thing, measured by other methods, so that it isn't just some sort of subjective, I groove to this and I don't groove to that and so on, but it is a way of measuring a real deep condition in the particular things that are being compared or looked at. And what's odd about this, and in a way as our work went further and further, it kept bringing big practical matters always back to the human person. So in other words, you take a parking lot. There's lots of technical problems in a parking lot. I mean, it's got to work. Cars have got to be able to move around. There's security problems. There's in and out problems. There's not very complicated ones. But I mean, anyway, it's essentially a technical thing. And the question is, okay, is it working well or not well? And yet, the functionality of the thing measured by various ordinary bits of technical discussion correlates with this condition of, do I feel myself to be more whole when I am in this parking lot, let's say, as compared with that one? Or even in engineering design, for instance, where one has the structural behavior of a bit of a bridge, or the patterns of movement in something where a lot of people are walking about and there's sort of complicated questions about how they move and so forth. I mean, very, very practical matters are nevertheless correlated with these very personal questions about whether the thing has life, whether it promotes life in me and you. So there began to be developing, in my views on this, a view of structure, which at the same time that it was objective and it was about structures that are out there in the actual thing, is somehow coming home more and more and more all the time into the person. Because the life that is actually in the thing is correlated in some peculiar fashion with the condition in ourselves when we are in the presence of that thing. And just to go a little bit further than that, what it meant was that the objects that are most profound, or again, when I say object, I mean, again, building, street, doorknob, shelf, room, dome, bridge, whatever. The objects that are the most profound, functionally, are the ones which also promote the greatest feeling in us. Now that's a very peculiar thing, because of course if you just hear that cold at first sight, it sounds like rank sentimentality, and you just say, well, it can't be true. Why should it be true? And yet it's a discovery which accords very well with the times, because we are living in a period where that is perhaps the most noticeable and most problematic feature of our world, is that feeling has been removed from it. When I make a joking reference to this room, and without going on beating a dead horse, but I mean, really the problem is that whatever feeling there is in here is obviously not a profound feeling, and the failure of that profound feeling to exist in the world around us at small scales, large scales, middle scales, here, there, and everywhere, is tragic. It's the thing that we miss. And of course, people have been writing about this Well, for many decades, I mean, writers have been, have of course made this known. We all know it. The difficulty is that people don't seem to know what to do about it. And if anything, at the moment, I'm talking now again about my own discipline, I mean that of architecture, but the problem is really getting worse. It's not getting better. The world that is being built is more unfeeling. We are, in a sense, more lost, more fragmented, more sort of wandering about in this lonely desert than before. So that if there is a way of looking at structures which both deals with real functional structure in the ordinary technical and practical sense, and simultaneously has its roots or its origin in this question of human feeling, that will be a very huge and positive step. It is a very peculiar intellectual development. And I mean, I need to stress that the apparatus within which these kind of things that I'm talking about here are true or are made visible and look reasonable is quite complex and somewhat unfamiliar. So it is actually a slightly different worldview from the one that we are currently engaged in. In particular, just going back to these 15 properties that I mentioned and the ability to be precise about the nature of living structure. At the root of these 15 properties, there appears to be a recursive structure with only one type of entity. This entity, in my own current writings about it, I call them centers. One might, I suppose, probably call them a lot of things, and I think there may even be, at a stretch, a little bit of a connection with some of the things that you call objects. These centers are in effect field-like structures that appear in some region. They don't have a sharp boundary, but they are the sort of focal organizing entities that one perceives. And within the view that I'm putting forward here and that I've gradually come to in this last decade and a half, everything is made of these kind of centers. The centers are more living or less living, and that's essentially the only important property that they have. And the question of whether a center is more living or less living depends recursively on the amount of livingness in the other centers that it is made of, because each center is actually a structure of other centers.
In this edition of The Way It Is, the fourth of our special reports on how we love the land, the new, wasteful, often destructive, but nevertheless exciting shape of the cities. Our reporter, Ken Foley. Let's go.
That's one way to build cities, and most of tonight's report deals with what we do to the land and ourselves when we build cities that way. But there's another way. Back downtown in the old urban centers, we're building the cities of Canada for the second time. First, we knocked down the original cities, square blocks and sometimes square miles at a time. Then we build them up again, nearly always out of vastly larger building blocks than anything we used the first time around. Do we do all this well, or do we do it badly? That's the starting point for this inquiry. And for the answer, we went to the lady over there, the one who's trying to edge her way into the traffic on Toronto's University Avenue. She's an American who moved to Canada last summer, Jane Jacobs, author of the definitive book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and quite possibly the best qualified critic in the world to do for you what she does now, review the kind of job we're doing, as we build Toronto and Montreal for the second time.
I hate University Avenue. Toronto's a very refreshing city to come to from the States. It's all full of romanticism and quirks and surprises and ingenuity, particularly in the way outdoor space is used. In Markham Street Village, the way those front yards of former residences, which are now shops, have been made into really wide sidewalks. Marvelous for window shopping, for sitting around in. This is another aspect of this Toronto genius for using bits of outdoors. This is not usual in most cities today. This isn't a dead city. There doesn't seem to be much creativity at the top. It seems to me that Toronto has kind of a split personality, a civic schizophrenia. On the one level, there's the spirit of, individuals and small groups who do things, what you might call the vernacular spirit. This is all very informal, ingenious, quite romantic, and full of fun, a great deal of fun. It seems to me that the official spirit of Toronto is stamp out fun, pompous, impressed with mediocrity if it's very, very big and expensive. In Montreal, I have a feeling that both the official spirit of the city, what's understood as the top civic kind of thing, is changing, and also the spirit of the individual citizen of Montreal. They didn't show the spirit of fun and adventure and adaptation of the city in little ways in the past. But now, the official city seems to be taking much more cue than in the past from what the ordinary citizens want, and in turn, the ordinary citizens, I gather, are losing some of their suspicion of the government, the establishment. Probably the biggest single menace to Toronto right now is the Spadina Expressway. The minute you take an expressway into, not up to, but into the dense part of the city, then you have very large numbers of cars coming on and going off at certain restricted points. At those points, you get into terrible traffic jams. The traffic has to fan out right there into the city streets. Now, suppose the Spadina Expressway comes down to Bloor. You have to sort out at that point cars which want to go nearby and ones which really want to go a considerable distance east on Bloor. To sort those out, you have to have the Crosstown Expressway. That must follow. Now, these expressways don't meet each other at nice right angles the way they look on maps. They are like plates of spaghetti. They have to have interchanges. Every expressway that's built produces its bottlenecks. And if they're to be countered, it requires more expressways. It also requires narrowing the sidewalks and cutting down trees to widen streets, doing away with any little random parks or sitting areas that interfere with the traffic, making many, many more parking lots. The whole city thins down and is more and more given over to cars. Everything's been sacrificed to the car. So why come in? Well, now in Montreal, they have an expressway that comes across the river right to the downtown, and it halts there. And it does fan out its traffic right there instead of carrying it any farther. Another expressway is going to be built more or less at right angles to it. But again, it's not so bad because it's not as if they were doing this at St. Catherine Street, main shopping area, nor is it as if they're doing it at the riverfront. Montreal is one of the few cities that has resisted putting an expressway across its riverfront. And that gives it a lot of future leeway for waterfront development that most other cities don't have anymore. I think most people in Toronto recognize that the ravines are a very unusual feature. Well, what is very likely to happen to the ravines if the official mines have their way entirely is that they'll all become highway corridors and poison alleys. They get all full of exhaust from the cars, to say nothing of the general roar of them, so that the illusion that you can run expressways through them and still use the slopes as parks is, it's just not so, you know. They're pretty well ruined for any use once they get a high-speed, heavily used expressway through them. I notice frequently criticism that Montreal has done so much building, including Expo and very grand buildings, and there doesn't seem to be much slum clearance. I think it's one of the most fortunate things about Montreal that it hasn't gone in for slum clearance, because the only ways so far that slum clearance has been done pile up new problems faster than they get rid of old ones. There's one thing you can see so far, which is a combination of rehabilitated buildings and new ones. But they're still not satisfied with this, and are still experimenting. Every city needs to be making this kind of experiment. Most of them talk about it, but Montreal really is trying to do this. Another interesting thing that's been done there is the old part of the city was, of course, once the old commercial and financial heart of the city. And then as the city moved northward and westward, it went downhill. It was more or less abandoned. Instead of wiping that out, what's happening is rejuvenation that's going on there, plus encouragement by the city of the existing downtown to move somewhat southward and eastward so that the two are linking up, and there will be a fairly continuous fabric of city. This is very unusual. I don't know of many cities that have ever succeeded in doing this in Toronto. I think that people in charge don't trust their own instincts. They're trying to do something that they think is proper and grand and right. It's often imitative. University Avenue is imitative of many such city beautiful malls in other cities. Toronto Dominion Center is imitative of office buildings on a platform, put the people underground. And the surface is really quite dead and dull. When people doing the humble kinds of work in a city can't get access to capital, then their work itself becomes a dead end. There may be money for sophisticated technology, but at the other end of the scale, there's abysmal stultification. This is why in all North American cities today, problems are piling up unsolved. Economic and social discrimination have an awful lot to do with it.
Ready, steady, go.
Ok.
Vite.
Alors, on va revenir, pour mettre un peu en ordre, l'optiquement correct. Optically correct, comment vous dites?
We come back to make some order to the optical correct.
Optically correct.
Optically correct. Optically correct.
Ok. C'est très, très, très important.
Very, very.
Parce que c'est une vision politique.
Because it's a political vision.
L'optiquement correct, la big optique, la mégaloscopie, est le fondement de la politique présente et à venir surtout.
The optically correct So the megaloscopy is so important. It is the foundation of politics now, and certainly the foundation of politics to come.
Il ne s'agit pas de la société du spectacle de Debord.
Has nothing to do with
C'est
society.
beaucoup plus qu'un spectacle.
Sorry, it has nothing to do with the society of spectacle as Guy Debord developed it. It is much more than a spectacle.
Je prends l'exemple de la perspective du Quattrocento. La perspective de l'espace réel du Quattrocento est toujours parmi nous. Personne ne pense au Quattrocento quand il regarde un arbre ou une femme. La perspective de l'espace réel du Quattrocento nous a envahis. C'est pas un spectacle, c'est un être qui nous a totalement occupés, qui nous occupe tous les jours. La perspective, la ligne de fuite, tout ce qu'on a dit ce matin, le relief dont on a parlé ce matin, les trois dimensions, cette intelligence de la profondeur de champ de la perception, c'est pas un spectacle, c'est l'être même au monde. Nous sommes au monde à travers le Quattrocento. Nous le sommes toujours et nous serons toujours. Donc l'inverse, la perspective du temps réel est de même nature. Elle va nous envahir, elle nous envahit déjà, mais elle va envahir notre imaginaire, tout, absolument tout. La ville, le moindre objet, le moindre design sera optically correct. C'est pas un spectacle. Je suis pas d'accord du tout avec Debord. Debord est encore un... Je sais pas, moi, j'ai jamais été passionné par cette idée. Certains ont essayé de nous rapprocher. Je dis non, moi je suis un militaire. C'est pas un spectacle, la guerre. C'est une tragédie. Il y a quelque chose de vrai ou faux dans la guerre. On gagne ou on perd. Le spectacle, on applaudit ou on siffle. C'est de la gadget. Le mot spectacle ne correspond pas. Y compris dans les phénomènes de médiatisation de la guerre. On est à un autre niveau.
So, I was. Many people tried to put me together with Guy Debord and the Society of Spectacle, but it's a profoundly different thinking, and it's not. I have nothing to do with spectacle. I'm more military, and it is. If we go back to this, for me, if we go back to as we did this morning to the Quattrocento and all the dimension of perspective, seeing the perspective, it is something which is, of course, today still there. Nothing has changed. The space is still there. The dimensions, the three dimensions are, of course, are there. If we look at an object, we look at a man or a woman, whatever. It is always. It has inhabited us. And we have inhabited the perspective, of course, of the real space, espace réel. But as well as for 500 years it has inhabited us, and we have inhabited this perspective, now the radical change to the real time will be as important as it was for the Quattrocento, the perspective. So this is where we will start. We are with it. We are in it now, and for all our future, at least the future that we here in our lives will have, and our children, we will be in this perspective of real time. This does not mean that the perspective of Quattrocento is lost. Not at all. It is still there. But this new perspective of real time will change profoundly all what we. It will inhabit us and change profoundly what we inhabit. And again, just for Guy Debord, to put this very clear, and Paul has written about this as well, it's a profound difference. He's not interested in the spectacle at all. The spectacle for him is like a gadget, nothing more. It starts, it's over, fini. Has a certain time. And this has nothing to do with real time.
And with war.
And with war, of course. Yeah.
Et en ce sens, on peut dire que l'image a pris le pouvoir au détriment de l'imagination. Là encore, Lacan, alors là, il serait là, on aurait beaucoup à dire. L'image a pris le pouvoir, puisque la vitesse c'est le pouvoir, l'image a pris le pouvoir sur l'imagination. C'est un événement énorme qui concerne la culture et la civilisation.
The image has taken over the power. Power being always conceived acceleration. The image has taken over the power, and there now, had Lacan been here, we could have a highly interesting discussion. And it has taken over the power au détriment.
To the detriment of the imagination.
To the
detriment of imagination.
To the detriment of imagination. And this is the image having taken over the power to the detriment of imagination. And here we are again in real time, of course. Is the crucial development we are in.
La vitesse sert à voir autrement. Et c'est cet autrement qui fait problème sur le plan politique. À la fois dans la guerre, on l'a vu avec la bande de Gaza ou avec les journalistes embarqués à la guerre d'Irak, c'est là la question.
The speed serves to see differently. And it is this differently that makes all the problems. All the problems in politics, all the problems we've seen from Iraq war to the Gaza war. This is the central problem.
Pour combattre cette situation, je dis bien combattre, avec mes étudiants, je leur faisais faire 4 heures par semaine de dessin sur table, les yeux bandés. Je développais l'imagerie mentale. Je leur disais, étudiants en architecture évidemment, l'architecture c'est pas trop difficile à dessiner, je leur disais, tu travailles sur un projet, masque de relaxation, dans mon atelier il y a plein de photos, les étudiants avaient tous un masque de relaxation et ils dessinaient le projet mentalement pour mettre en œuvre leur imagerie mentale, pour résister à l'imagerie de l'ordinateur, des palettes graphiques et des logiciels.
To fight this situation, when I used to work with my students at the École Spéciale d'Architecture, the Special School for Architecture, I asked them to blind themselves with those things you have.
Put blindfolds on.
Blindfolds?
Yeah.
Blind? Oh, this is very nice. Blindfolds. Yeah. To put your eyes in folds, in a certain way. To put blindfolds on, and in order to, during 4 hours, in order to activate their mental imagery, and to design, of course, design architecture, the construction of the buildings or the perception of the buildings they were having.
Pour que les images mentales viennent équilibrer les images instrumentales de l'ordinateur. Pour équilibrer les deux.
To have a balance between mental imagery and instrumental imagery of the computers and software.
Par exemple, je leur donnais un petit exercice, je leur disais, voilà, tu vas faire n'importe quoi, une maison de campagne, une maison pour un riche client. Écris ce que tu veux faire, ne le dessine pas, écris ce que tu veux faire. Ils avaient leur terrain, je leur donnais un terrain qu'ils connaissaient, évidemment il faut une base, un terrain, les orientations, tout ça, mais ça c'est basique. Je leur disais maintenant écris comment tu vois ta maison, écris-le. Et une fois qu'ils avaient écrit la maison, je disais maintenant masque de relaxation, regarde là, elle est là, tu vas la construire là. Et moi-même je leur relisais pendant qu'ils avaient les yeux bandés, ta maison, elle est comme ça, elle est ouverte sur le nord, etc. On passe de living, etc. Et il y a du béton là, il y a du bois là, etc., etc., etc. Et ça devenait une véritable conception mentale du projet. L'architecture est causa mentale. Il n'y a pas que la peinture, comme disait Léonard de Vinci, qui est causa mentale. Pour que l'image mentale domine l'image optique.
So it's in order to be able that the mental image is dominating the optical image. I asked them prior to get their eyes in folds, blindfolded or the blindfold on. I asked them to write the project. Right. We had this discussion about Bright. No, we had this yesterday about Bright. To write it down. Of course, all the projects at the architectural school were very precise projects. So they knew the terrain, where the construction was going to be. So the dimensions of it and the urban situation. So write it down first, and then take the blindfold on, or put it on. And while they had it on, Paul was reading to them their conceptions of the architecture. So this is the construction, the mental construction.
L'imagination de l'écrit et la parole déclenchait l'image du projet.
So the imagination of the writing and the speaking liberated the imagination of the project, the image of the project.
Pas besoin de souris. Et après, bien sûr, ils allaient dans le labo et j'utilisais les ordinateurs. J'ai rien contre les ordinateurs. À condition qu'il y ait l'équilibre entre imagerie mentale et imagerie instrumentale.
So there was no mouse in there at that point of conception. Of course, afterwards they were starting on with the software to work on the screens. But first, in order to be able to balance themselves, to have the balance of the optical, the mental imagery and the optical imagery.
Donc l'optiquement correct, c'est vraiment un événement historique majeur qui concerne l'image animée sous toutes ses formes. Le passage de l'image fixe à l'image animée à travers la lanterne magique et à travers la chambre noire et à travers la caméra et à travers l'invention de Niepce et de Daguerre et de Talbot pour l'instantanéité, ou des frères Lumière ou de Muybridge, a été une révolution majeure, bien plus importante que la locomotive. On nous dit la machine à vapeur, à côté de cette invention, nous étions déjà dans la vitesse de la lumière. Là. Nous allions vers la vitesse de la lumière, tandis que la locomotive, elle allait à peine vers le supersonique avec la TGV.
So, I mean, if we talk about megaloscopy, or we talk about the optically, huh?
Yeah, optically correct.
Optically correct. Of course, it is the transition between the fixed image to the moved to animated image, and going back. I mean, we go back from the Latana Magica to cinema, passing by photography and everything else. And one has to see that this was the true revolution. We're still within it. This was the true revolution, far of velocity, far more than locomotion by train. No, the speed of light. If you compare the speed of light and the train, where you still could run in front of it, like in Belgium, they were always running in front of the train when it came into the gare, to the train station. So this is what megaloscopy is about. This transition, fixed image, technological image always, and then to animated image.
The language doesn't describe the world in which we live. We're describing a world that existed in a human form with the best of intentions, where morality is real. The world we live in has nothing to do with morality. When the Pope appears, or the head of state, and they call for world peace and unity, these are hollow words. They don't mean anything to me. They have no authenticity. Nations don't have friends, they have interests. We will do anything to achieve our interests, and that means eradicate other people's ways of life, take away their language, all for the benefit of them. It's not human to be able to change the world. That's a fascist idea. It's an idea that comes from evangelical and technological thinking, to think that all people can live the same way. everything now is situated in technology. In that sense, from that point of view, technology is the new host of life. Technology is the environment of life. It's something that we've created, but like Frankenstein, it has a life of its own. For me, technology is like an ontological earthquake. We live in two worlds, the world of the rooted future, which is the world of technology, or the world of the uncreated future, which is the world of art. That's the rooted future is the world where I am completely pessimistic. The uncreated world is the world of hope, because that's the world that comes out of the fecundity of our imagination. To try to make this world better is, I think, hopeless. One has to have the courage to be hopeless about this world in order to create a more livable world for oneself. I try to take 1,000 pictures and offer you the power of one word so that you can begin to rename the world in which you live. I learned as a monk that if you want to see your ordinary world in an extraordinary way, you had to stare at it to the point where it started to look strange. I try through the camera to look at the world that is assumptive, that's all around us, that we see every day but never see because it's so present. I try to stare at it, make that background the foreground or the subject, so that confronting that, it starts to look strange. Then that image starts to speak to us. My films aren't about meaning. If you want to have meaning, then you have advertisement and you have propaganda. If you saw a sign for Coca-Cola or Coca-Cola, excuse me, the meaning would be unmistakable. If you saw a socialist realism film, the meaning is propagandistic and unmistakable. Whereas if you were in an art gallery and saw a painting and there were 100 people in the room, hopefully there could be 100 different points of view about it. This is the power of art. It leaves you free to have your own point of view. Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian activist of the 60s, who was considered public enemy #1 for the Brazilian junta, was that not because he commanded an army or because he was a revolutionary leader, but because he taught people literacy. And by that, I don't mean to read and write. He taught people how to reclaim their language. He taught people how to rename their world. We are free because we can say we are free. That's what makes us free. Our language creates the world that we live in. But if our language is official, if our language is assumptive, if our language is business, then our language doesn't create the world, it continues the madness of what this world is. There's a mad rush to consume drugs, and I think that's in an inverse relationship to how much our words have lost their meaning. Drugs give us access to things that our language no longer explains. Our societies of, quote, enlightenment and development predate on the societies of diversity and simplicity in the South. We demand if they develop with aid, and the way that we say they develop, through the World Bank, through plans that we offer them that they must do in order to join the global world. To do that, they will lose their soul. This is how we live. Our life is predicated on the destruction of other people's ways of living. You may think that's severe, but when we see the disappearance of language, the homogenization of culture, the magnets of big cities bringing people in from all over so that they can be more developed, so that they can have a higher standard of living. What is higher? That's a value judgment. Higher means having a more affluent life. Those of us that live in the north, that have an affluent life, find ourselves isolated in this comfort and find ourselves possessed by the very things that we seek. For many people now who graduate from university, that certificate becomes their death certificate because they no longer can afford to question the world they live in.
Marshall McLuhan, way back in the early 50s, you predicted that the world was becoming a global village. We'd have global consciousness. And I'm wondering, now, do you think it's happening?
Well, you've heard of Julian Jaynes, the bicameral mind, and the split up of same, and the rise of consciousness.
So your prediction is correct. We're into it?
No. I think it's now we're playing backwards. We're going back into the bicameral mind, which is tribal, collective, without any individual consciousness.
But it seems, Dr. McLuhan, that this tribal world is not friendly.
Oh no, tribal people. One of their main kinds of sport is sort of butchering each other. It's a full-time sport in tribal societies.
But I had some ideas. We got global and tribal. We were going to become.
The closer you get together, the more you like each other.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of that in any situation that we've ever heard of. That when people get close together, they get more and more savagely impatient with each other.
Well, why is that? Because of the nature of man, or
his tolerance is tested in those narrow circumstances very much. Village people aren't that much in love with each other. And the global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations.
Do you see any pattern of this in, for example, the desires of Quebec to separate?
I should think that they are feeling very abrasive about the English community and about the way the American South felt about the Yankee North 100 years ago.
But is it a need for space?
No, it's a need for a less abrasive encounter and a little more space between the wheel and the axle. When the wheel and the axle get too close together, they lose that playfulness. There's no play left. And so they have to have a bit of oil, a bit of distancing from each other, and so on.
And is this distancing, is this going to be a pattern right around the world?
Apparently, separatisms are very frequent all over the globe at the present time. Every country in the world is loaded with regionalistic, nationalistic little groups. Even Belgium has a big separatist movement.
But in Quebec, for example, they define it as the quest for identity.
Yes, all forms of violence are a quest for identity. When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You're a nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody. And so you become very violent. And so identity is always accompanied by violence. This seems paradoxical to you? That ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them in violence. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed.
And all this is somehow an effect of the electronic age?
Oh no, but people in all times have been this way. Mm-hmm. But in our time, when things happen very quickly, there's very little time to adjust to new situations at the speed of light. There's very little time to get accustomed to anything.
Would then the quest for identity of the French Canadians and the kind of inherent violence that you speak of, that's concomitant with that, it would have not come so soon without
electric technology? Yes, right? That's true. Things like radio can push people up into a new kind of awareness, which makes it very difficult for them to relate to other people. Ireland has shown many responses to this situation. in its relations with North and South of Ireland and its relations with England. I mention them because everybody tends to know a bit about that.
Right.
And has been irreconcilable until now anyway. The English representing the highly literate society and the Irish representing a more oral and a much more communal, tribal group. And where the tribal feelings are strong, radio sends them up the wall. So radio has sent tribal societies around the globe up the wall with intensity of feeling. One of the big violence makers of our century has been radio. Hitler was entirely a radio man and a tribal man.
And what does television do then to that tribal man?
Well, I don't think Hitler would have lasted long on TV. Like Senator Joe McCarthy, he would have looked foolish. He was a very hot character. And like Nixon, made a very bad image on television. He was far too hot a character. Much better on radio or on the movies. Not bad on the movies, which will take quite hot characters. But Nixon was hopeless on TV.
The investigations now of the CIA and the FBI and even our own, God forbid, RCMP, has this anything to do with the electronic age?
Well, yes, because we now have the means to keep everybody under surveillance. No matter what part of the world they're in, we can put them under surveillance. It has become one of the main occupations of mankind, just watching other people and keeping a record of their goings-on. This is the way most businesses are run. Every business has a huge espionage sector. And this is called public relations, and it's called audience research. And this is around the clock. And this has become the main business of mankind, just watching the other guy.
And invading privacy.
Invading privacy, in fact, just ignoring it. Everybody has become porous. They got the light and the messages go right through us. By the way, at this moment,
right,
we are on the air, and on the air we do not have any physical body. When you're on the telephone or on radio or on TV, you don't have a physical body. You're just an image on the air. When you don't have a physical body, you're a discarnate being. You have a very different relation to the world around you. And this, I think, has been one of the big effects of the electric age. It has deprived people really of their private identity.
So that's what this is doing to me?
Yes. Everybody tends to merge his identity with other people at the speed of light. It's called being mass man. It began quite a long time ago.
God save us. New technology, you say, is a revolutionizing agent.
Yes, it creates new situations to which people have very little time to adjust. They become alienated from themselves very quickly, and then they seek all sorts of bizarre outlets to establish some sort of identity by put-ons. Show business has become one way of establishing identity by just put-ons. And without the put-on, you're a nobody. And so people are learning show business as an ordinary daily way of survival. It's called role-playing. Role-playing has become the normal mode of survival in the business world. Jobs have disappeared, as it were, but role-playing has come in on a huge scale. And it's much more flexible than job holding. And jobs are rather static, repetitive things, whereas role-playing is very flexible. You can play many roles, but you can only have one job at a time.
Now, we're reached a point now where everybody 24 years and under is the TV generation, right?
Yes.
Do you feel these young people out there under 24 have been totally tribalized?
They have lost their sense of direction. They do not have goals. They don't have objectives. And that is putting it mildly.
You think that's new?
I think that is typical of the 24 years and under. And yes, I think that's new.
You say, too, that between today's child, who's been raised electronically, and who must still live in a literate world, because we are still in a literate world, that there's a 2,400-year gap between that boy or girl and his parents.
And his parents, who grew up in a literate society. Well, the alphabet, the phonetic alphabet, the beginnings of Western literacy came in about 500 BC. And since then, between then and now, is approximately 2,500 years. And we are the first post-literate generation, as it were. That is we have bypassed the literate world of hardware and the lineal left hemisphere technology. We have bypassed it by moving once more again into the altogether world, the holistic world of the right hemisphere people, who are the third world people. So what is happening to our own children is we're watching them become third world.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that they feel much more groupy and trendy than they do private or goal-oriented.
I see.
And so the disc jockeys help this along in a huge way, and there's all the nostalgia. By the way, one of the big marks of the loss of identity is nostalgia. And so revivals on all hands in every phase of life today. Revivals of clothing, of dances, of music, of shows, of everything. We live by the revival. It tells us who we are or were.
Now these children that are more groupy and less private, are they also more passionate or more violent?
I think that the sheer dislocation of their lives has put them through a very violent course indeed. They have been ripped off.
But they're kind of rudderless.
They don't have goals.
Don't have goals.
Because at the speed of light, what is a goal? You're already there. You name it and you're there.
The violence of the media, you say, itself, invading those not prepared for it. It's not the content that's primary, it's this invasion of privacy that people are not prepared for that is destructive.
Recently had this trial of the young man who appealed to Kojak as his alibi for murder. This is a pathetic thing because nobody ever mistook fictional entertainment violence for reality. It's impossible. Only people who are leading merely a drugged fantasy life could do that. And there is the strange factor that television is quite a potent drug. It is addictive, it is an inner trip, and it is a tranquilizer. And recently the Detroit Free Press offered $500 for anybody who would stop watching television for a few days. And they didn't get many takers. But those who did take up the thing dropped out very quickly. They couldn't bear it.
Do you feel that the fact that you and I have enjoyed the rewards of literacy, that we are more protected against television than
Yes, I think you get a certain immunity. Just as you get a certain immunity from booze by literacy. The literate man can carry his liquor, the tribal man cannot. That's why in the Muslim world or in the native world you cannot, booze is impossible. It's the demon rum. However, literacy also, though, makes us very accessible to ideas and propaganda. The literate man is the natural sucker for propaganda. You cannot propagandize a native. You can sell him rum and trinkets, but you cannot sell him ideas. Therefore, propaganda is our Achilles heel. It's our weak point. We will buy anything if it's got a good hard sell tied to it. And so propaganda is the great big soft spot in the makeup of the literate man.
I see. Electronic people, you say, lose their religion very easily.
Well, their attention span is very weak, as you know. We have invented the one-liner in place of the joke, because people can't wait around to hear you tell a joke. It takes too long. As for critics, said Sam Goldwyn, don't even ignore them. That's a one-liner. and that's all we have time for. There was a wonderful one-liner in the Morning Smile the other day. The teacher asked, somebody define for me nothing. And a child put his hand up at once and said, teacher, when you peel a balloon, what you have left is nothing. That's a one-liner. It's all we have time for. Attention span gets very weak at the speed of light. And that goes along with a very weak identity.
And religion, which involves ideas, requires a little more time.
Well, religion is a form of indoctrination which requires a considerable amount of literacy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Kim from a music magazine called Groovy. Mm-hmm. And actually I have a question, but I'd like you to expand on one of the earlier questions about Lolita and the censorship we practice upon literature and a lot of other art forms. What is it a sign of, in your opinion? And why does it devastate you?
What is...
Or the way we try to rewrite history, suddenly Nabokov and Henry Miller and other authors are being...
well, Flannery O'Connor, they've just taken a name off a library. William Faulkner. These writers that were, for me, fundamental to my development, in particular, weirdly enough, are being dropped off syllabuses in universities and in school. You know, they're just complex. They have complex views upon life and upon sex and race and these sorts of things. They have complex, nuanced, difficult relationships with these ideas. And the idea that we can somehow purify the past by just cancelling these particular books will somehow make our past a better place is just crazy, as far as I'm concerned. An affront and a complete affront to the concept of art. And you just don't know where that's going to stop. I mean, you're a music magazine. Music has, in a way, has remained a little bit immune to this. It's not a big problem within music, but it's coming. I would say it's coming. It's coming for music too. And I just feel that we are adults and we should have the right to be able to make these decisions about what we listen to and what we read ourselves, and not have a committee of people, whoever they may be, taking these things away from us. Why? I'm not sure. I think there's I don't know why. Why do you think? You don't know? I mean, I think there is that. I don't know why that's come about. I don't know. I mean, I know that there's philosophical ideas behind it, but I don't know why they have come about. I know that there's an idea, I think now, that we must identify ourselves not as individuals, but as collective identities, and this is part of the situation. But I don't know why. I don't know the why of it. But it's a thing. It's a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael from Kristi Dagblad. In connection with what we're just discussing right now, you once wrote that the Christian concept of grace is the opposite of today's cancel culture. Could you please expand on that notion?
Did I say that?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah? I guess The idea, yeah, I guess the idea of mercy. Yeah, I'm not. Did I mention grace? I think mercy is a different thing. I just feel that there is a division within society at the moment that is finding its oxygen from a kind of brutality and lack of forgiveness. I think that this concept is a Christian concept, perhaps, forgiveness. I'm not so sure about that. We need to bring it back into our society in some kind of way. This idea that you can be, the reason being because if we don't have forgiveness, then we don't have freedom to speak our minds. We don't have freedom to make mistakes. And the way we grow as human beings is to make mistakes. We make mistakes and we learn from them. If we make a mistake and we are suddenly, our lives are over, let's say, our lives are cancelled, then we don't have freedom to grow, and we don't have freedom to grow as a society. That's what worries me about it. I don't actually like to use the word cancel culture, actually, because I don't think that's the right word, and it makes it's like a cartoon, word that's used about this, and I think it's more subtle than that. But I think we need the freedom to make mistakes. That's what life is all about, as far as I'm concerned.
So where are you at? So now you're just a believer, and there's the doubt and the rationality.
No.
You're not? Okay. So can you extrapolate a bit on that?
Well, in regard, do I believe in God?
Yeah, and do you practice?
I go to church. I pray.
You go to church services?
I go to church services when I can. I pray, I read the Bible. Much of this stuff I've always done, actually.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like, if it smells like a dog, it probably is one. And I would say that might be to do with my religious feelings, that I've always felt that I never, what's the word, that I could never go the full distance with religion, even though I really, really tried, and have always tried. And I think through the conversations too, it became clear that this work and this attempt at finding that the search was the religious experience in itself.
Yeah.
It wasn't ever arriving somewhere. In fact, the arrival to belief is often extremely problematic and very quickly becomes dogmatic and overbearing.
And you don't think you're any of those things?
I don't think I'm overbearing.
Or dogmatic, okay. And it's fair to say, I mean, I'm still tentative about this, obviously, but it's fair to say that Arthur changed this and made you consider, I mean, at one point you say in the book, you're a stronger man than me if you don't look for some kind of religious.
If what?
You say that people who go through grief and loss and don't look for spirituality and religion are made of stronger stuff than you are. You were grasping at anything you could hold on to.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what concerns me about secularism or atheism as a firm position on things, that it's very often looks down on people that are struggling and finding some sort of solace in belief, even if it's a belief in what might be something that isn't true. And I think in a lot of ways, the idea that something is just true enough, let's say, that it gives some kind of solace, and that there's some utility to that belief is something I find it very difficult to look down at or consider to be a lack of courage or intellectual dishonesty or magical thinking or whatever criticisms are thrown at people who do believe in things. I think that the utility of religion very much is the thing that can guide you out of some very dark times, and is for me certainly was and I think remains necessary.
Yeah, and
the idea of God and a belief in God is a secondary notion to me. It's like a minor detail to some degree. It's what religion itself and the condition of religion can give to you that helps you out of can guide you out of the darkness.
The fact of the matter is that the free marketplace took into account in 1964 that there were bulging museums and empty churches, and under the circumstances,
you're absolutely right.
You quite legitimately take into account, if you are, if you're inclined to philanthropy, what it is that most needs philanthropizing. Is that right? What most needs help?
Well, it's what most puts your foot in the door of heaven. And
well, that's another consideration, I agree.
Yeah. And today, what most puts your foot in the door of heaven is giving to art.
Yeah.
And in fact, art today fulfills the two historical functions of religion apart from matters of theology. One is for the rich, the legitimation of wealth. Just as tithing used to put your foot in the door of heaven, giving to art will do today. And for people without money, it's the established form of religious abnegation of the world. Now, I'm one of the few people that I know who rides the subway often, and it's marvelous any morning, particularly on the West Side IRT, to get on there, and when the meat spigot is turned on full tilt, and everyone is elbow to rib and shank to flank and haunch to paunch and all the rest of it, and you think you can't survive another second, and to look over at a seat and see a young lady or a young man who seems to be enveloped in absolute pink shell, absolutely apart from all of this, absolutely unaffected by it. And you'll always see in his or her lap a book by Hermann Hesse or Kierkegaard or Martin Buber or someone of that stature, and you get the picture immediately. And this individual is saying, I may be in this rat race, and I may be headed for my job as file clerk, bank clerk, a stenographer, but I am not of it. I am of the world of culture and cultivation. You can even see their room at this point. You see the monk's cloth, and you see the...
But when you say it, even in the manner in which you say it, is that a vacuum word? It's not plain whether you mean to say that it's genuine or not.
Oh, I think it is.
For instance, in the case of John F. Kennedy, you say that when he had to sit down and listen to Pablo Casals, he was in physical torture. And I think the probability is that you're correct. Still, he was doing the right thing, in the same sense that the Queen of England, when she goes to the museum every 10 years, is doing the right thing. But you did say, this is all great, i.e. the hegemony of the new religion, except that the American people have always had a great talent for not giving a damn about what their spiritual leaders expect them to do. They have taken their money and their free time and started expressing themselves in highly visible ways that are having much more impact than anything that is going on in culture. Their music has been rock and roll. Their dance has been the twist. Their theater has been the movies. Their sculpture has been California custom cars. Their kinetic art has been the electric signs of Las Vegas. You sound like Nabokov, by the way.
Well, I don't mind that company. I don't endorse it wholeheartedly. There, I was specifically talking about the culture centers, such as Lincoln Center and the ones in Los Angeles and all over the country, in which public land has actually been appropriated in the name of high culture, in which, in fact, the last segment of the masses or the people that actually attends a concert at Lincoln Center, let's say, is the night that the wives, children, and members of the Brotherhood of Operating Engineers are invited to the dress rehearsal. That's the last time they show up. Nevertheless, the millions are actually expended in the name of the public. Now that is somewhat different from what is going on in art, except that within the world of art, it's always important to have as devil figure these millions of people in the country who are denouncing, causing to wither away, or otherwise assaulting the artists and keeping them from having their just desserts as
What would be the musical analogy of that?
I'm really much less well acquainted with music. Now there is the field of serious music still, which the tone was set really by 12-tone music, the decaphonic music by Schoenberg and others.
Music, not serious. It could be both, but
I think
it's primarily experimental.
I think it was considered serious when it was done.
Yeah.
That there is a corner of modern music to which the same things might apply, but I think it's only a corner. And I'm sure you could find the same thing in drama. You'd have to look awfully hard in the field of drama to find it. And perhaps in literature, if you get into the what I call the neo-fabulism in the novel, in which finally you have to set up a fiction collective in order to get your works published.
Mm-hmm.
And so these things exist in a small way in other fields, but in art...
Drama is regulated by the expense of its production, right? I.e., it has to attempt to be more appealing because you just simply can't... You can buy a canvas for $10, but you got to put up $100,000 to stage a play.
Well, it's even gone beyond that into movies. It's the technology more than the technology has changed it. Mass production of books was a technology. Mm-hmm. Now, the technology of reproduction in art was never went over, despite Malraux's statement. It just simply never went over.
By which you mean what? That it was not popular?
It wasn't popular. It was not accepted as a true reproduction. Now, a book is can be accepted as a true reproduction of a manuscript. Yeah. You could make a very esoteric argument that the manuscript has something more in it, as many libraries do, but the book is usually accepted as a fair copy. This is not true in art. And actually, if you look at reproductions, you can see that the reproductions don't have certain qualities of the original. They don't have, you can't see the paint, you can't see certain colors. And this has kept the magical quality of art alive. But the attached to all of this is the mythology that critics and art historians have wanted to keep alive. I think that's why so few art critics today know any art history. They seem to have taken a survey course, probably the one that the Museum of Modern Art sends out that John Russell wrote. I was absolutely astounded to read one of the great, I think, quite apart from whether it redounds to my glory or not, one of the nice things that's come out of this whole furor over this book is the way it has smoked out certain unbelievable assumptions and beliefs on the part of people who really should know a great deal and who know very little. I mentioned Franz Klein in the book. So the art critic of Time magazine takes my reference to I mentioned that Franz Klein once did pictures of social realism, of unemployed Negroes.
He says you were thinking of somebody else.
And he says, in fact, Franz Klein never painted such pictures. The first thing I was taught on the Springfield Union when I started in journalism was never to use the word never. It always leads you into serious trouble.
It's unsafe, yeah.
You shouldn't use the word always either. That was another word you couldn't use. Yeah. Well, I have sent off to Time magazine a copy of, I unfortunately was able to find one that has both in it an unemployed Negro and a crippled ex-serviceman, which I hope they will be, I hope they will print. But for a critic of Time magazine not to know that Franz Klein, who was famous as an abstract expressionist, that Franz Klein went through a realistic period, including a period of social realism, seems to me unbelievable, because I am not an art critic or an art historian, although I did get into this field somewhat in graduate school. But this seems to me just one of the things that you, along the way, you just simply notice. It is incredible to me that a man who is the art critic of Time magazine, this is one of the leading magazines in the country, doesn't know something like this. Or that John Russell, who is the second string art critic of the New York Times, began a piece in which he said, "Art and ideas are one." Now, I must give him credit for this. If you ever have a preposterous statement to make, and I offer this as a suggestion to anyone who has something they know to be preposterous, they have to get off, say it in 5 words or less. Because we're always used to 5-word sentences as being the gospel truth. Usually it's in a novel and someone says, his pants leg was torn. Well, you accept that. His pants leg was torn, for God's sake. I mean, you don't dwell on it. And usually short sentences give you a statement that's just simply you can accept in passing. But art and ideas are one. This encapsulates the argument of my book about modern criticism.
Yeah.
Even on the most physical level, art and ideas are not one. Art is made up of objects. Ideas are made up, is in the realm of philosophy. But on a higher plane, the very art wouldn't exist if it were not supra-rational, if we're not above the rational, above the realm of ideas.
Or extra, anyway.
Or extra. I'm avoiding the word irrational, because that's not the point.
Yeah,
the fact is that it goes straight to your memory bank, and it affects it in a way that ideas don't, just as music does, if it's good. We're assuming talent here. And so to say that art and ideas are one is preposterous on the face of it. Even Russell seems to realize this, because he then says, of course it's possible to enjoy, he puts enjoy in quotes, which I rather like, it's possible to enjoy a painting without knowing the theory behind it. Just as it is possible to enjoy, in quotes, a kabuki play without knowing Japanese. Already you're getting into language where...
he just repealed his dictum.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he's realized that something's gone badly astray in this whole thing, and so then he says, the history of art is a subdivision of the history of ideas. Already we're into the history of art rather than art. Well, I think it's important that this has been smoked out, that someone can say the art and ideas are one, because that is really what the book says in a nutshell, that they have become one, and it's an unnatural alliance.
Finally, some thoughts about the intrinsic values of art. Poetry and plays and paintings, they present imaginary worlds. So representational art gives us an opening onto the world of the imagination. And they all rescue their subject matter from a purely instrumental conception of its significance. Things portrayed in art are not portrayed as useful, they're portrayed as interesting for their own sake. So they're rescued from their instrumentality. And that's why every illusion matters. The image is a distillation of the thing depicted. And poetry and painting work in the same way. Here is a landscape by Van Gogh, which everybody knows probably. That the brushstrokes there imbue the landscape with an observing consciousness. They are marks of the moral being for whom this is not a thing, but a vision. To absorb that, you recognize that it's a very long way from the way a field of wheat with a flock of rooks above it would look. But nevertheless, It says restart required. I mean, it's referring to me. So, right, I'm restarting. It doesn't look in any way realistic, but somehow it has a power that it wouldn't have if it was wholly realistic, because the brushstrokes of the painter imbue that landscape with his own soul. And it's as though the imagination of the painter had reworked the thing that he's painting, so that it isn't just the thing, it's also that thing distilled into his own consciousness. So in the imagination, we are thinking about absent and non-existent things, but the consciousness involved is a creator of its own object, as in that case of Van Gogh. The imagination is something that we can will. I can ask you to imagine some things. I should say, imagine a field of wheat. You won't be able to imagine it like Van Gogh did, but nevertheless, you will summon it up in obedience to that order. And that is an interesting thing. And through the works of the imagination, we bring distant things into close relation with each other. That's what we do in figures of speech in poetry. We're bringing things into relation with each other. And with the brushstrokes in the painting, we're bringing a human action in relation to a landscape. And these imaginary worlds that we create can strike us as true or as false. And I want to contrast that Van Gogh with a painting by Thomas Kincaid. This is one of his visions of paradise. This is a controversial painter, as you know. Van Gogh died in poverty. Kincaid died leaving $53 million and died of drink. And was, I think 1 in 10 American households have a Kincaid above their mantelpiece, because it's a soothing thing that is, for some people, this is a vision of what painting should be. It's much truer to the appearance of things than Van Gogh, but there's a question about it. What is that question? Many people say that there's a falsification behind this kind of painting. I don't want to cast judgment on it, but just to say a few things about it. Why does this strike so many people as false? In one sense, it's truer than the Van Gogh. It's closer to the way things actually look. But the falsification, if it exists, is a falsification of the observer rather than of the observed. It shows a world presented through a veil of self-congratulatory sentiment. That's at least what the critic would say. It tells you that you are a good person and no further efforts need be made. Van Gogh is not telling you that at all. He's telling you that life is rough and you need to make efforts even to see this. So it tells you that no further efforts need be made, and that meaning lies in the forms and the colours, those pastel shades smeared over the landscape like a disease. So, well, is that right? Leave it to you to think. But whatever, this brings us back to the parallel between art and religion. Religion provides us with truth, but it's not just straightforward literal truth about the way the world is. There are stories, all sorts of things that we believe, but there's a much more important dimension to it, a truth, a spiritual truth, and which tells us how things really are for us, and what our position really is in the world of human relations and human emotions. And in religion, we recognize that there's no redemption through falsehood. And the same seems to be true of art. That's what those two pictures, I think, at least lead us to suppose. That art, too, has its own way of presenting the spiritual truth of things. And if it falsifies, then it doesn't produce the kind of redemptive consolation that we're looking for. And this might explain, going back to sadness in works of art, it might explain the power of tragedy. In tragedy, you go to the depths, but you find a kind of rescue there. So only if you go to those depths, however, will you be rescued. Enjoying sadness for its own sake and just sentimental pretense at grief is not going to help. but actually going to the full encounter with human mortality and what it means, as in a real tragedy, maybe that is a help. Maybe that does take us to a point where we can actually learn something that we need to learn it in our hearts and in our emotions, and learn to bear this thing. Perhaps that is why we want to go to tragedies again and again. So art is certainly not going to be any help to us if it loses sight of what we are and what we need.
At this point, I reveal myself in my true colors as a stick in the mud. I hold a number of beliefs that have been repudiated by the liveliest intellects of our time. I believe that order is better than chaos, creation better than destruction. I prefer gentleness to violence, forgiveness to vendetta. On the whole, I think that knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and I am sure that human sympathy is more valuable than ideology. I believe that in spite of recent triumphs of science, men haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. And in consequence, we must still try to learn from history. History is ourselves. I also hold one or two beliefs that are more difficult to put shortly. For example, I believe in courtesy, the ritual by which we avoid hurting other people's feelings by satisfying our own egos. And I think we should remember that we are part of a great whole, which, for convenience, we call nature. All living things are our brothers and sisters. Above all, I believe in the God-given genius of certain individuals, and I value a society that makes their existence possible. These programs have been filled with great works of genius. In architecture, sculpture and painting, in philosophy, poetry and music, in science and engineering. There they are. You can't dismiss them. And they're only a fraction of what Western man has achieved in the last 1,000 years. Often after setbacks and deviations at least as destructive as those of our own time. Western civilization has been a series of rebirths. Surely this should give us confidence in ourselves. I said at the beginning of the series that it's lack of confidence more than anything else that kills a civilization. We can destroy ourselves by cynicism and disillusion just as effectively as by bombs. 50 years ago, W.B. Yeats, who was more like a man of genius than anyone I've ever known, wrote a prophetic poem. And in it he said, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Well, that was certainly true between the wars, and it damn nearly destroyed us. Is it true today? Not quite, because good people have convictions, rather too many of them. The trouble is that there is still no center. The moral and intellectual failure of Marxism has left us with no alternative to heroic materialism, and that isn't enough. One may be optimistic, but one can't exactly be joyful at the prospect before us.
Well, that about wraps it up. I hope you got something out of those different voices. I do. I find it interesting just to listen to people. And not to listen and kind of stop them in my mind to argue with them, but just to listen, to try to understand what they're saying before you can actually engage with someone's ideas. You have to simply listen. You can't simply, in your mind even, interrupt them before they're finished. And so that's why I've presented you with these people with interesting ideas, and I hope you had a chance to listen. Well, this is Byrne in Tbilisi, Georgia, reminding you that, well, swim against the stream. Live differently. And as the Georgians say, drobit, temporarily. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.